Good morning, everyone. I have the joy and privilege to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Dr. Amy Noelle Parks. Dr. Parks is an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education at MSU. Prior to her role at Michigan State, Dr. Parks was an assistant professor of early childhood at the University of Georgia. Dr. Parks is interested in young children's mathematical experiences both in and out of school. She is particularly concerned with representing the experiences of children from marginalized groups in the research literature and with promoting humane schooling practices for all children. Her current projects include investigations of the role of play in mathematical learning, the resources parents draw on when supporting their children in mathematics, connections between emotional relationships and content learning in primary classrooms, and the mathematical engagements that are possible in informal spaces. Her work has been featured in many publications, including For the Learning of Mathematics, Teachers College Record, and the Journal of Curriculum Studies. She has also authored the book, Exploring Mathematics Through Play in Early Childhood Classrooms. In her free time, Dr. Parks enjoys writing young adult romantic comedies, including Summer of Brave, The Quantum Weirdness of the Almost Kiss, and Leah and Beckett's Abracadabra. Today, Dr. Parks will share with us what it looks like to move toward joy in early mathematics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Noelle Parks.
All right, so a little later in the talk, I'm going to actually discuss obstacles to joy. You have already discovered one of mine, which is technology. But the thing about obstacles is they're there to teach us about what gives us joy. So when we think about joy in early mathematics, we might have a lot of images that come to mind. So maybe it looks like kids playing with interesting toys, and exploring like three-dimensional parts of their world as they do that. Maybe it looks like kids engaging with each other about a mathematics problem and modeling it with materials. Maybe it looks like pre-K in a number talk arguing about how many dots they see up on the screen. But what I know for sure is it doesn't look like this. And that's what I see too often when I go into early mathematics classrooms. So we are here today to talk about how we find joy for our kids, but also for ourselves. And I'm really aware that in this moment, talking about joy, it is both a precarious endeavor and also a privilege. Because there's a lot of things out there that are pushing against our ability to feel joy in schooling right now. But I was talking to someone really smart the other day, and she said, what we have to do is separate the pressures of schooling from the people who are doing the work. And I think this is really good advice. So what I want us to think about today is how we build relationships with each other that are joyful, so they can build relationships with their kids that are joyful. So I thought I would start, and this is the thing that's giving us so much trouble, is by thinking about where we see joy, both in maybe what I would think of as like typical, stereotypical example of when I say joy in early childhood, here's something that comes to mind, and something that's maybe a little less typical. And we're going to come back to these videos later, so I'm actually not going to have you talk about them right after you see them, but it might be helpful to make some notes. And what I would like you to think about is, where are you seeing evidence of joy in the videos? Which I am now going to try and play. All right, so the first one is a pre-K class out near Grand Rapids.
This one is bigger.
You got the toppings for the count?
Thank you. I'm gonna use it. Okay. Here's yours.
1, 2,
3, 4, 5,
the most?
That one.
That one. How do you know that?
Because Melon makes a big melon.
Because it made a big mountain or tower
Yes.
when they stand up. Okay, which one has the least?
That one.
Nope, the least, the smallest. Which one is the smallest? Is he right, Obs?
Yeah.
Yes. 1 is smaller than 10, so that it has fewer cubes. Are you all done with it? Yeah? Are you going to go play someplace else? Something?
Yes.
You stacked all the Unifix cubes. What is that?
4.
4. Let's see, are you going to make a pattern or are you gonna... They all have numbers. How are you going to play with them?
By counting.
You're going to play with them by counting. Okay. So what number was that?
1.
And how many ice cream scoops did you put on?
1.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's how you do it. Like this. Oh, now you're supposed to hold it that way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
All right, what comes after 5?
6.
6.
1. 2.
They don't really connect together though.
3. 14.
Can you count?
And then this is a second grade classroom at Godfrey Lee.
And I do have a story problem for you. And it is a story problem about Takis. So up on the board, we got our Takis. Okay. There are nitro Takis on the table. There are also fuego Takis on the table. How many Takis are on the table? So what's happening in this story? What is happening? Daisy. It's about Takis. What's going on with our Takis? Rosie.
That some of them are eating them. They're probably eating them.
Someone might be eating them. Is there any eating them in our story?
No.
No. So maybe they're going to eat them, but they're not yet.
It's Addie.
So Trey, what do you see happening?
I see happening right now is there's some Takis on the table and some nitro Takis on the table.
Okay.
But we don't know how many.
Okay. So what are they asking us to find out? Ivana.
How much Takis are on the table?
So how many Takis are on the table? At your desk, I do have papers for you. I've got the same page. On the first line, I'm going to have you write 58. The second line, I'm going to have you write 36. Okay, so there are 58 nitro Takis on the table. There are also 36 fuego Takis on the table. So how many are on the table? If you look under on the bottom,
There's space.
there's space.
So you can show your work.
So you can show your work. What ways can we go ahead and show our work? Ivana,
Number line.
a number line,
Number block.
number blocks. Trey, do you have a different strategy we haven't talked about?
Is the one that we just did like a minute ago.
Oh, like mental math strategies and write your thinking as you do the mental math? Okay, excellent. So boys and girls, I'm going to have you walk very carefully and get started.
All right, so just take a couple seconds, really, if you haven't yet, and jot down where you saw evidence of joy in the two videos. And as I go through the talk, I'm going to hopefully build a conception of joy, and I want you to see if that brings new lenses to what you're seeing in the video. So When I began my work around joy, one of the first books I read, which I would truly recommend to everyone, is The Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It's a beautiful book. And in it, they unpack their concept of joy. And one of the things I really like most about this book is the stance they take, where they say being joyful is not just about having more fun. We're talking about a more empathetic, more empowered, even more spiritual state of mind that is totally engaged with the world. And I think this is important broadly, but also really important in early childhood, where this idea of joy gets conflated with play. And like, I'm going to be talking about play this afternoon. I am the biggest proponent of play, but that's different from what I mean when I talk about joy. Joy is about this empathetic, more empowered, more engaged state of being. So that's a lens I'd like you to bring to those videos, to think about not just the ways in which kids were happy, but the ways in which kids were more empathetic, more empowered, more engaged with each other. And they do this thing where they sort of break down characteristics of joy or kinds of joy. Pleasure, amusement, contentment, excitement, relief, wonder, bliss, exultation, pride, elevation, and gratitude. And while I think that we might conceivably find all of those things in a mathematics classroom, I feel like these 6 are ones that tend for me to stand out when I visit classrooms. Seeing pleasure, amusement, pride, excitement, wonder, and elevation. And one thing that I have become increasingly sure of as I've done this work is that joy almost always takes us closer to the mathematics. It is not in opposition to the mathematics. The more joyful our classrooms are, the more engaged our kids are with mathematical ideas, the more engaged teachers are with teaching in ways that help children bring out mathematics. So if you think about that first video you saw with Trish and Rusty of Morgan, who I have to say was a 3rd-year teacher when they took that video. And I also want to say that Rusty stood up here all aw shucks of who knows why that school has all that fabulous teaching like that and all those fabulous teachers. I sort of have an idea about why that might be true because he has done so much work in that space, and I want to acknowledge that. But in Morgan's classroom, you feel that joy from the kids, from Morgan, as she experiences the teaching. It is not getting in the way of the mathematics the kids are doing. It is contributing to the mathematics. Okay, so now I am going to ask you to talk. I would like you to think about 2 moments of joy for you, one that you experienced as a math learner. And that can be both in a classroom or it could be somewhere out in the world, just a moment of joy around mathematics. And then the other thing I would like you to think about is a moment of joy that you saw in school, that you witnessed in school, and what was going on in that space. And so now I want to give you a little more time, 5 minutes to talk about your moments of joy, and I'll let you at your tables decide how you want to break that up. Go ahead. All right, can I bring us back together here? And what I'd like you to think about right now is if you are going to make connections across the moments of joy that you just heard at your table, what are features that you would say were part of, if not all of the moments, then many of the moments? So what connections did you notice across those moments of joy? I think someone is out there with a microphone, and I'm wondering if someone might be willing to sort of share a connection you noticed at your table across these moments of joy. Yeah, and Trish is there. Way over here, Trish. Okay, you can start loud, and then we'll get to the mic when it gets there. Relationships with other human beings. Correct. Excellent.
Or a dog.
Maybe we'll just shout out. Or a dog. I love it. Let's get two more. What's another connection people notice? Way in the back. Success. Good. What's another connection? Yeah. Pride. Okay, excellent. So keep those in your head as we go forward. So there's not a ton of what we would call empirical research about joy. There is a lot of empirical research about happiness. I use joy because I really want to take up that idea from the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu of this sort of more expansive concept. But the research on happiness is not unconnected. And we know a couple things. Happiness research has sort of identified these three characteristics that make people happy. So the first is a pleasant life. And that means all the things you might think of ordinarily. You're not struggling too hard to feed and clothe yourselves and your family. You're not experiencing serious illness at the time. All those things. The second is flow. And flow is this deep engagement we get with a task. So it's when you're doing something and you don't notice that time is passing. You're not checking your phone every 5 minutes. You're not getting up to get a snack out of the refrigerator. You're deeply engaged in the work that's going on. And the last is meaningful life. And meaningful life is this broader feeling that you're contributing to something bigger than yourself. And actually, what happiness research has shown is that it's the last one that is most important for people's overall happiness state. That when they feel like they are living a meaningful life, that creates enough happiness to sort of carry them through those moments in their life that maybe are not so pleasant. And that no matter how pleasant your life gets, if you are not leading a meaningful life, then it's hard to sort of achieve that highest level of happiness. There's also been research on happiness in schools. And we know that both children and teachers do better when they are happier in schools. There's a recent study that shows that teachers are less racist when they're happy. They are more likely to respond equitably to all of the children in front of them when they are happy. There have been studies that show that high school students who report that their schooling was like both work and play do better in all kinds of long-term measures, which is great news. The bad news is only 10% of high school students report having that experience. Okay, but what does this have to do with the early math essentials? So I want to start going back to those core values and connecting that to joy. And I often think about our values as being like the electric shock clause of our essentials. Because I swear to you right now, there are educators out there, often working for for-profit companies, but not always, who would promote putting electric shocks on children if they thought it would raise test scores. There are absolutely people who would recommend that. And I see practices in schools all the time that are maybe a slightly less egregious version of that. People doing things that are not good for kids because they raise test scores. And what our values say is, whether it works is actually not the most important question. The most important question is whether it is creating equitable, authentic, caring relationships with kids. And if it's not doing that, I don't actually care what else it's doing. It doesn't matter. Thank you. So what I think joy is sort of a handy little catch-all to say, like, if I walk into a classroom and people are experiencing joy, I'm pretty sure these core values are being uplifted. Maybe not all of them, maybe not all the time, but we are moving in that direction. And if I walk into a classroom and it feels miserable, I am pretty sure these core values are not being uplifted for both children and teachers. I'm already behind and I'm going to stop and tell a story I did not plan to tell. So when I was first starting out as a professor in Georgia, I went out to an elementary school to do a professional development session on, I think, fractions, because people always want to talk about fractions. And I walked in, And as I was walking down the hall, I heard an adult in the building say to a child, "That's why you're going to end up in jail." And when I went into the library, I stood up there and I said, "I guess what? We can't talk about fractions because people can't learn math if that's the building that they're in. Like we have a first level problem that we have to deal with before we can think about why does dividing fractions make sense." And you know what the teacher said to me was, "You want to know how many times I was yelled at by an administrator today? 3. And when you're dealing with that all day long, it's really hard not to let that go through you into the kids." And I thought, I bet that's true. So it is easy sometimes, certainly for me as a teacher educator, to fiercely defend children. It is sometimes harder for me to imagine what circumstances might cause adults in a building to treat children as less than fully human. But often it is not because the people showed up in that building wanting to harm children. Like truly, there are many easier jobs out there, right? Like no one goes into teaching because they want to harm children. No one does. And so if people end up in that space, it is because institutions push them there. And so as we think about promoting joy for teachers, we have to think about how do we create spaces that will create joy for teachers so they can create joy for children, because those two things are symbiotic. And that's something that it took me a while to unpack, but I fully believe it now, and we got to be there. So what I'd like you to do now is, we're not going to watch these videos again, but think about the 2 videos that you saw. And at your table, I would like you, well, first let's do this. Go and open up in that little folder to where it talks about the values. The essential practice values, not the school center-wide ones. And just look at that real quick yourself and refresh your memory about what those 5 core values are. And then let's say in like 2 groups at your table, so they're slightly smaller groups, talk about, you go ahead and pick either one of those lessons, the play lesson in pre-K, the story problem lesson in 2nd grade, and how was the joy that you witnessed in that lesson tied to those 5 values? Where do you see that relationship there? Go ahead and do that. So my hope is that in looking at those videos, you saw that those moments you sort of instinctively identified as moments of joy before we'd unpack joy at all. You just looked at it, and maybe you're looking for kids' smiles or their body language or whatever it is that human beings use to read joy in each other. When you went back and like re-examined those moments through the lens of the values, then you could see, oh yeah, I see this value of care and authenticness here. I see this value of mathematical exploration here. I see this value of a range of ways to get into mathematics here. That those values are more specific lenses on this particular kind of joy that we can create in a mathematics classroom. And so now what I want to move toward is a little bit thinking about the actual essentials. And so if you think about those 8 essentials, or you read through them, like some of them might to you seem, well, like, yes, of course this is related to joy. You know, the first one is play and tinkering. It's very obvious, that connection to joy. You know, you cannot have play without joy. It doesn't exist. Maybe, I was going to say the one with families, you might automatically connect to joy, but that is not actually always the conversation I hear. I hope that you would see that the relationship to families is also a source of joy. But maybe there are some like in the middle where you're like, I don't know, that doesn't really seem all that joyful to me. And what I want to encourage us to think about is that yeah, even those can be spaces of joy in a mathematics classroom. So these pictures are from, this is actually from Georgia, not Michigan, but same classroom. One is a play setting where the kids are building with Legos and trying to make models of something. So definitely mathematical thinking, easy to imagine joy happening there and two kids working together. People talked about relationships as being part of joy. But in the second picture, we see a child working alone on a story problem, writing out his answer. I'm not sure if you can see from there, but his tongue is out as he's working. And what I hope that you can see in his body is that there is a kind of joy here too, right? I think that Clinton in this moment is experiencing flow. Kids are moving around the room. They're doing all different kinds of things. They're talking to each other. And he is really focused on representing his thinking about this problem. And I think there's a lot of things that went into that moment, right? There's the creating of a classroom culture where kids feel like they can be engaged, but also he knows this poster is going to be up on the wall and his friends and his teacher are going to look at it. So there's this potential source of pride, right? That he's going to get to share his work in this way. I think there is some elevation here because the challenge in the problem was just right for him. If we think about that cognitive demand essential, this is a problem that was not too easy, it was not too hard, it was pushing him to understand something about mathematics, and that's what created that state of flow. So I want to encourage us to bring this lens of joy, not just to mathematical play and tinkering, but to all of the other ones, especially as we think about pleasure, excitement, pride, and wonder. Where is it in the essentials that we can create spaces for these things to happen? And I thought I would spend a little time on Essential 7 because story problems often, depending on your mathematical schooling growing up, may not have been a source of joy for you, right? They were this hard thing that you had to do, or if you were fast at math, then they were this extra work thing that you had to do when you already finished all of the work that the teacher assigned, and now she's now go do these story problems. And so you're not feeling this joy about it, but we saw already in the video where the teacher's launching the problem about Takis, this evidence of joy in the classroom. And some of it was the context, these kids were clearly excited about Takis and doing a problem like that. But also there was an excitement about unpacking the problem and getting to solve it and doing it collectively. And I have, is seeing both excitement and wonder in the lesson. I have an emotional attachment to story problems because they are the thing that taught me to feel joy in mathematics. So this is a picture of me 30 years ago now, when I was a third grade teacher in North Carolina. And I'll tell you, so teaching in the 90s, if there are people who are old enough like me to remember this, I was part of this reading, writing workshop revolution, right? So my kids were reading all different books and they were writing their own books and we were having author nights. And in social studies, we were doing these community walks where we were going all over the place and interviewing people and the mayor. And science, I had literal chameleons in my room and I hate chameleons. And then in math, I was open up your books. We're going to practice these 3 problems right here. You're not going to speak to each other. You'll finish up the 12 and turn them in. I mean, it was like an alien invaded my body during math teaching. It looked nothing like the rest of my day. And I simply didn't know that math teaching could look anything different. I was just well, that's math. No one likes it, but we all have to do it. That was where I was. And then I went through this professional development, and it's so weird to talk about because I know the reputation professional development has, but it changed my life. I mean, it changed my entire life. And a lot of it was founded on this idea of slowing down around story problems, of writing problems about context that kids in my room understood, about instead of racing through as many as we could to get the right answer, of letting kids solve it in different ways that made sense to them, of using any materials that they wanted, and then of like getting together afterwards to talk about how they did it. Like, I literally didn't realize you could talk in math. Like, that was news to me. And hearing my kids start to share how they were thinking about things, that's what changed my relationship to mathematics. All of a sudden, it was a part of the day I was excited to do because I didn't know what my kids were going to come up with next. And I didn't know what I was going to have to be like looking up that night, and like not online because we didn't have computers then, but in like my giant old Vanderwell book on my desk. And so that ability, like, to have kids surprise me and delight me and to have a social relationship with them, that came out of story problems. And so I know that that's not going to be everyone's entry into the essentials and entry into joy. But what I do know is somewhere in those 8 essentials, there is an entry point to joy for every single educator out there. There just is. And it is the job of people like us in this room to find those entry points and to see what they are and to go in that way. And the hard work is it might be different for everyone. And that's tougher than saying, we're all going to start with essential 2 because that's the most important and everything builds on that, so let's all do this. Like, to do the work well, we have to talk to and listen to the people in our buildings. And we have to build from there. But I mean, truly believe can be done. Okay, so I promised I was going to talk about obstacles to joy. And the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu unpack this too. And they say obstacles to joy often stem from one of these emotions: fear, stress, anxiety, frustration, anger, sadness, grief, despair, loneliness, envy, and suffering. And if we think about public schooling right now, we can think there are a lot of opportunities to feel many of those things, right? Like, we won't sugarcoat it. But I think we have to think about our obstacles to joy for ourselves, for our teachers, for our kids, and then we have to do what we can to remove them. And so I'm going to think a little bit about our obstacles to joy now, and in particular, fear, stress, anxiety, frustration, and loneliness. I think that if you've been in the classroom, these feelings resonate, and we can really think about how to start alleviating them, I hope. All right, here's my little warning, because I am going to share one of my obstacles to joy. And I have decided to be honest about it, and I wanted to share an obstacle that was of a particular grain size, right? Because, like, I'm sure we would all say, you know what, the pandemic is an obstacle to my joy. Like, I agree, it is. But, like, there's probably not a lot you and I are going to do in this room to remove that. You know, it is an obstacle to my joy that parents are out there trying to ban books about Black and brown kids and queer families. But there may not be a lot we can do in this room right now to challenge that, although I think we should all be working toward it in our lives. But there are actually a ton of really tiny, small, movable things about schooling that create fear and stress and anxiety that we actually could do away with like that. We could snap our fingers and they could be gone. And again, the trick here is they are not the same for everyone. Like, my obstacle to joy might actually be something that brings you joy. And when I share my obstacle to joy, like, some people might feel uncomfortable, but like Rusty and Trish knew who I was when they invited me up here. So like, they can edit it out of the video if they don't like it. So what I'm trying to steer you toward thinking about is obstacles to joy that do create fear and stress and anxiety, but that actually are a lot more movable than some of the bigger ones. Like, let's do the easy lifts first. So my personal obstacle to joy is learning targets. And if I were to try and explain like why learning targets are an obstacle to joy for me, I actually found this explanation by someone who was advocating for learning targets, but it exactly describes why I don't like them. If you own a global positioning system, you probably can't imagine taking a trip without it. Unlike a printed map, a GPS provides up-to-the-minute information about where you are, the distance to your destination, how long until you get there, and exactly what to do when you make a wrong turn. But a GPS can't do any of that without a precise description of where to go. So, that is for me not how I like to travel. I like surprise. I like surprise from my kids, and I like surprise at the end of a lesson. And so especially for me, having to put a learning target on the board and then having to have all my children recite it, it feels to me like we picked up a novel and I read them the last page before we even started. That robs so much joy for me of the act of teaching, and also I feel like it robs joy for them of the act of learning. So am I saying I don't think I should have any idea of what I do when I walk into a classroom? No, of course I have an idea of what I should do when I walk into a classroom, but I am open to taking the wrong turn. And for me, taking the wrong turn often means following children's thinking. They often say things that I did not expect they would think. I've been doing this work a long time, and still when I go in and teach model lessons, kids say things I did not anticipate. And if I am so focused on my learning target, what I'm going to do is try and yank them over to that, right? No, we don't have time to hear that, talk about that. We're going to skip right over that, and I'm going to move on to someone who's going to get me to this exact destination that I know I'm having to get to, right? So this is not actually intended to be, it's a little bit an argument against learning targets, but my broader point is really that your obstacles will be different. Your teacher's obstacles will be different. It might be, in the pre-K world, it might be these insane portfolios that teachers spend more time creating than actually listening to their children. It might be the curricula and thinking about what you want to take in and put out. It might be it might be data walls, that's what this is. It might be classroom management systems. So wherever those obstacles are for you and your teachers is where you need to focus that attention, but really thinking about what are those little ones that you think you might actually be able to move to reduce fear, stress, loneliness, anxiety from the teachers that you work with. And so we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to give you 3 of those. Talk at your tables about what some of those little obstacles might be. So, Rusty, in the introductory session, said today, these 2 days are not going to be about getting a checklist or a prescription for here's how to do the essentials. Our hope is that we can set you off with sort of a broad intention of exploring them. And my hope is that you will do it in a way that seeks to make your experience with mathematics and teachers' experience with mathematics and kids' experience with mathematics more joyful. If it doesn't do that, then we did the essentials wrong. So if there is a part of them that is making people in your building miserable, then you need to not do that part. Let joy be your guide. And I want to finish with this beautiful quote from the Dalai Lama, who says, "This day should be meaningful." Meaningful means, if possible, serve and help others. If not possible, then at least not to harm others. That's a meaningful day. Thank you.